Okay, so now we're moving on to chapter 26, where we're going to talk about fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. So, not all of us contain the exact same amount of water. The total amount of water that we have in our body is a function of our age, our body mass, what sex we are, and the relative amount of body fat that we have. So, infants have a very low body fat and a very low bone mass, so they are going to have the most water. So, about 73% or more of an infant is water. After infancy, our water is going to decline throughout our lifetime, accounting for only about 45% in older age. If we're comparing males and females, typically males are about 60% water, while healthy young females only about 50%. And the differences in the water content between a male and female reflect the fact that women or females typically have a little bit more body fat and a little bit less skeletal muscle than males. Of all of our body tissues, our adipose tissue is the least hydrated, meaning it contains the least amount of water. And even bone contains more water than fat. So that's an example there. The next thing we're going to talk about are water occupying compartments. So we have water occupying two main fluid compartments within the body. So about 2/3 by volume, we're going to find water in intracellular fluid, which we also refer to as ICF, which actually consists of about 1 trillion of tiny individual compartments, which we call cells. If we're talking about an adult male of an average size, the ICF accounts for about 25 liters of the total 40 liters of body water that they have. If we're talking about extracellular fluid compartments, this is about the remaining 1/3 or so of the body water, and this is going to be residing outside of cells. So when we classify things as extracellular fluid, we're talking about the body's internal environment. So things like our plasma, the fluid portion of our blood, along with interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between the spaces between tissue cells. We also have other types of extracellular fluid that are distinct from the plasma and interstitial fluid. So things like lymph or cerebrospinal fluid, the humors of our eye, synovial fluid in our joints, serous fluid between our membranes, and those gastrointestinal secretions that we talked about. So water is basically a universal solvent, which means that most of our solids are going to be dissolved in water. We can classify solutes broadly as either being electrolytes or non-electrolytes. So when we're talking about electrolytes, these are chemical compounds that can dissociate into ions when in water. And when they dissociate into ions, we're talking about anions and cations. So these are charged particles, meaning they can conduct an electrical current. So that's why we call them electrolytes. So these are going to be things like inorganic salts, both inorganic and organic acids and bases, and then some proteins. If we're talking about non-electrolytes, these are usually bound by covalent bonds, not ionic bonds, and the covalent bonds are going to prevent them from dissociating in solution. So for this reason, we don't have any charged species that are created when we dissolve non-electrolytes into water. So most non-electrolytes are actually organic molecules, meaning that they contain carbon. So that would include things like glucose and lipids and creatinine and urea. What the example showing you here is, again, electrolytes are going to be the ones that dissociate into ions. So they tend to have a greater osmotic power than non-electrolytes. So for example, if we have a sodium chloride molecule, when placed into water, because they're bound by ionic bonds, they will separate into two different ions. So we actually, from having one compound when in water, now we have two particles. If we have magnesium chloride, as represented here, we're going to separate this compound into three different particles, one magnesiums and two chloride molecules. So we end up getting with three particles here. This is going to contribute to the osmotic gradient. If we're talking about non-electrolytes that are held together by covalent bonds, because they don't dissociate, one glucose molecule dissolved in water is still going to be one glucose molecule. So we have one particle. So they do not contribute to the osmotic gradient. So just a little more on the comparison of extracellular and intracellular fluids. If we look at each of the fluid compartments, they kind of have a distinctive pattern of electrolytes. Except for the really high protein content in the plasma, the extracellular fluids are very, very similar, meaning that the primary cation that's found in extracellular fluids is going to be sodium, and the primary anion that's found in extracellular fluids is going to be chloride. Plasma does contain a fewer chloride ions than the interstitial fluid, but that's not as important. Again, you're looking for the major cation and the major anion in these fluids. If we're talking about the intracellular fluid, it only has a very small amount of sodium ions and chloride ions. Its most abundant cation is going to be potassium. And its major anion is going to be phosphate. So when we're talking about the sodium and potassium ion concentrations in the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, they are nearly opposite. And this is what we refer to as a characteristic distribution of these ions on either side of the cellular membrane. So these are going to influence their activity. So for example, where we're going to have our sodium potassium pumps, which remember keep intracellular sodium concentrations low while keeping potassium concentrations high. So the sodium potassium pump pumps 3 sodiums out into the extracellular fluid, which is why we have a high ion concentration of sodium outside for every 2 potassium it brings in, which is why we have a high concentration of potassium on the inside of the cell. So if we're talking about composition of body fluids, and we can compare this, electrolytes are going to be the most abundant solutes that we have in our body fluids. And the electrolytes are going to be the ones that are actually determining what chemical and physical reactions are going to be occurring. So the bulk of the dissolved solutes consists of proteins, phospholipids, cholesterol, and triglycerides. We have about 90% of the bulk of the dissolved solutes in plasma, 60% in intracellular fluid, and 97%. 60% in interstitial fluid and 97% intracellular fluid. You don't need to memorize this. Like I said, this table over here. Just worry about the intracellular and extracellular major anions and major cations. So the ion concentrations are going to be influencing the fluid movement. We do have osmotic and hydrostatic pressures that also help regulate the continuous exchange and mixing of fluids. So water always moves freely among the compartments along the osmotic gradients. Solutes are unequally distributed, as we mentioned, because of their size, electrical charge, or even dependence on transport proteins. But anything that changes the solute concentration in any compartment is going to lead to water moving with it, so water flow. So for example, if we increase the extracellular fluid osmolality, water is going to leave the cell to the area of higher solute concentration. If we decrease our extracellular fluid osmolality, then water is going to enter the cell because now we have a higher solute concentration inside the cell. So water, again, always moves to the area of higher solute concentration. So our extracellular fluid solute concentration is really going to be the one that's determining our intracellular fluid volume. So we do have exchanges of fluids between the plasma and interstitial fluid that are occurring across the capillary walls. So we described the pressures driving these fluids previously in chapter 19. Just as a recap, the hydrostatic pressure of blood is going to force the protein-free plasma out of the blood and enter the interstitial spaces. And this filter fluid is then almost going to be completely reabsorbed back into the bloodstream at the proximal convoluted tubule. And that's going to happen in response to the colloid osmotic pressure of plasma proteins. We also have exchanges between the interstitial fluid and the intracellular fluid across plasma membranes. And these exchanges across the plasma membrane are going to depend on the permeability of the plasma membrane. So as a general rule, the two-way osmotic flow of water is going to be substantial, but ion fluctuations are going to be restricted because ions can only move through selective active transport proteins or through channels. So movements of nutrients and respiratory gases and waste are typically